and welcome. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all for this afternoon celebration of Hannah Pollin-Galay's recently published book, which is titled, Occupied Words, What the Holocaust Did to Yiddish. Hannah is especially great friend of the Yiddish Book Center. So on behalf of everybody at the center, we're delighted that she's here with us today to talk about the book and to celebrate the publication of it. Following today's program, for those of you who are here, we will have a book signing. For those of you in the virtual audience, know that the book is available online at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org. And there's also a small reception for all of you in our library. Hannah Pollin-Galay is Associate Professor in the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University, where she is also head of the Jonah Goldreich Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. In that role, she directs projects such as the International Summer Program and the Übersetz, an online journal for Yiddish Hebrew literary translation. She researches and teaches primarily in the fields of Yiddish literature and Holocaust studies, and has recently begun a foray into the field of I was watching Celia Dropkin last night, echo criticism. She's the author of Eulogies of Witnessing, Language, Place, and Holocaust Testimony, and most recently, Occupied Words, What the Holocaust Did to Yiddish. Also with us today, another great friend of the center's, Avi Pat, the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University. Avi holds a BA in religion with a Judaic Studies concentration from Emory University and a joint PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies and Modern European History from New York University. He's the author of numerous books on Jewish responses to the Holocaust. Also with us this afternoon, another great friend of the center, alum Michal Yashinsky, an actor, playwright, stage director, lyricist, and Yiddishist. Michal recently finished his new Yiddish drama, Blessing of the New Moon, which premiered at the Lower East Side Play Festival. He's performed the title role in Avram Goldfaden's operetta, The Sorceress, for which you can see him on the wall in our exhibition to your right, for which he was hailed by the New York Times for bringing a keen, if malevolent, psychology to the title role as Mordecai the innkeeper and Nachum the beggar in the hit Yiddish language production of Fiddler on the Roof, directed by Joel Gray. He's taught Yiddish language and culture at the University of Michigan, 5 colleges here in Western Massachusetts, and Workers Circle in YIVO. It's a really wonderful program. We're delighted that they're all here, and let's get on with the program. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to Elizabeth and to everyone who helped put this event together. And thank you so much for coming. So I think as you got the idea, we're doing things with a little twist. I'm giving you an overview of the book, and every so once in a while, I'm going to be interrupted by an actor who's going to perform pieces of the source work, the source material that I used to write the book. So you'll have to figure out what that means as we go along. Okay. I want to tell you a little bit about the book. I want us to envision right now that it is the spring of 1944, and it's in the Lublin area, which was liberated just around that time. And right around liberation, right on the heels of that, a man named Nachman Blumenthal, who originally came from Lublin, returns from the unoccupied Soviet Union, where he had been in refuge during the war. He had fled at the beginning of the war, leaving behind his infant and his wife. And he came back to Lublin, and he's looking for his family. He's trying to figure out what happened, and he's talking to people there, and he realizes he can't understand what they're saying. Even though Yiddish is his native language, Yiddish is their native language, there is somehow a language gap between them. And he writes in his memoir of the time, much of which these survivors told me I couldn't understand. Ordinary, everyday Jews now used words like Kripo, Obman, Aktie, Leistung, Rollkommande, Ken, Karte, Shaber, Shaber, Vinchuches. And I leave these terms foreign here to you as English listeners and Yiddish listeners, as they must have sounded to Blumenthal at the time as a speaker of normal Yiddish. Based on this experience of language shock, Blumenthal decided that he was going to go on a mission to collect words that had been invented in the Holocaust. And he did so by listening to conversations, walking around with a notepad and writing down what he heard. He literally dug through garbage cans and rubble piles and pulled out pieces of paper and recorded meticulously the new words that he found. And he counted eventually 3,000 words and phrases that were invented in Yiddish at the time. And he initially published them in 1956, between 1956 and 1963, serially in a dictionary called Wörter und Wörterlich von der Khurbn Yiddish, and later republished them in 1981. So I hope that all of us here who have a little common sense are saying, what is going on? A man has just seen his entire community violently wiped out. He also discovered that his infant and his wife were murdered, and his most urgent task is to write a dictionary. Weird. However, it was not weird at the time. He was not alone. Yisrael Kaplan, who was himself a survivor from Kovna, and he'd lived through, also survived the Dachau concentration camp. Before he even regains his bodily functions, he is recording words and he puts them together in a dictionary of his own. And over the Soviet border in Kiev, so that means with no interaction in real time. At the time, if you were in, the American occupied liberated zone of Germany, or you were in Poland, or you were in the Soviet Union, you didn't really have a lot of ways of communicating. So this means this was an independent project in Kiev. A linguist named Elie Spivak produced his own dictionary of a similar sort. And beyond these dictionary efforts, Jews were actually recording changes in the Yiddish language in real time in the ghettos. In the camps, it's another story. It's a little harder to get pen and paper there. But this is an example from the Warsaw Ghetto. Rabbi Shimon Huberband, new words and old words with new meanings. This is what he's writing down as he's experiencing starvation, loss, slave labor, imprisonment, an urgent task. And in the Lodz Ghetto, there was a team that created an encyclopedia of the Lodz Ghetto, and part of this encyclopedia entailed recording new words, and here are some examples. Yiddish was not alone in this regard. We know a lot more about German and how German changed under Nazi rule. Most famously, a book by a man named Victor Klemperer, who was Jewish by background, converted to Christianity, but was nonetheless persecuted as a Jew in Nazi Germany. He wrote a memoir cum lexicon, so a whole record of his experiences under Hitler, called LTE, Lingua Tertii Imperii. It's the language of the Third Reich. And he records his day-to-day experiences and how he heard words change from day to day in German. And there were other similar efforts in German as well. And we can also now say that there were similar efforts in French and potentially also in Polish. What makes Yiddish unique in these efforts is, first of all, no one studied them. So no one was really interested in them. And also the magnitude of the change. So Yiddish was a language of 86% of Holocaust victims. That doesn't mean that's the only language that they spoke, but this was one of their languages. And 5 million Yiddish speakers were killed out of 11 million worldwide. And that number is actually, in some ways, too small, because what the Holocaust destroyed was also the communities where more Yiddish language speakers would have come. The main, most intense Yiddish-speaking communities in Eastern Europe were destroyed. So it's 5 million at the moment, and then more over time. This is well known. Obviously, there are citations of other people, but I think that what's less well known and what was so important to these folks at the time, to Nachman Blumenthal, to Yisrael Kaplan, to Elie Spivak, to Shimon Huberband, was to say that the language is not just being destroyed from the outside, it's changing from within. And that change, that internal metamorphosis, is not just destruction. Something more interesting is happening here inside. And then we'd like to ask, why a dictionary? You know, there's so many ways of telling your story. There's poetry, there's painting, there's narrative, there's a diary. What does a dictionary have to offer? So here I turn to Umberto Eco, who writes about a dictionary, that dictionaries do not concern purely our linguistic knowledge without giving instructions as to how to use linguistic terms in order to mention things or states in the world. So in other words, Eco describes dictionaries and their generic kin as maps of meaning and maps of knowledge, how-to books, how to use knowledge in a society at a given moment in time. And if we think about dictionaries through Eco's lens, then maybe this makes sense, because a dictionary of the Holocaust would allow people to pause the flow of time and all of the rush of events, from deportations to roundups to cattle cars to gassing, to pause time and say, what was life like in a given moment? What were the relationship between different people and different objects and different roles at a given moment in time, and slow things down and give us a picture? And I think that that is what attracted people to dictionaries at this time as a very, very popular mode of witnessing. It sounds so strange now, but looking back at displaced person camps newspapers, we see that dictionaries were actually a popular genre of witnessing. So what were the topics that put so much pressure on the Yiddish word during the Holocaust that they required glossing and reglossing? These are lexicons that are labyrinthine in nature. We could enter their nexus at any one point and run into a topic and come out on a completely different topic, kind of like wormholes or worm tunnels underground. So I've chosen 3 entry points into this web of meaning that I'm calling Khurbn Yiddish, Holocaust Yiddish, theft, sex in the female body, and the Nazi German encounter with Khurbn Yiddish. I'm not going to talk about all 3 now. That's what the book is for. But I do want to give you a small taste of the topic of theft, which was incredibly important to people at the time. Lots and lots of words for different types of theft. And I'm going to invite Michal up to read a portion from Yisrael Kaplan's dictionary, The People's Mouth Under the Nazi Yoke, in a section related to different types of theft.
Und weil das Wort organisieren ist schon zu viel gewesen bekannt, haben Menschen genommen benutzen, auf dem euch andere ausdrucken. Zwischen die litwischen Jiden hat man gehört etwas jargonischen Kamsi. Die ungarischen Jiden pflegen es rufen Soirizny. Beim Organisieren hat der Mensch gemusst sein dreist, geschickt und besonders flink. Haben polnische und litwische Jiden das Organisieren euch gerufen Skok, a Sprungton von Slawisch. Gesagt hat man euch, gehen auf Skok. Ist das Organisieren nicht gewesen verbunden mit größeren Anstrengungen, hat es bei anderen Lodger geheißen Biegeln. Bügel heißt in Deutsch euch der Spitz von Tramway, was glitscht sich über einen elektrischen Kabel. Soll Tage das Biegeln, was hat gemeint, a leicht und glatt organisieren, haben seinen Abstamm von die jüdischen Tramwayführers in Lodger Ghetto. In die meisten Fällen aber ist das Organisieren gar nicht so leicht angekommen. Teilmal ist das gewinn verbunden na viele mit Einbrechen. Hat Asamin Meloche in Warschauer Ghetto bekommen dem Namen Schabern, Einbrechen, von dem hebräischen Shavar. Bei den Aussiedlungen dort im Ghetto, wenn die Wohnungen von ganzen Quartalen werden verlost von den Jiden und ihr ganzer Hobbengut ist geblieben für die Deutschen, pflegen die anderen Jiden von Ghetto sich federn, das Rauf durch die Nacht und allein heraustragen die besseren Sachen von die verlosten Häusern. Die ganze Unternehmung hat in Warschauer Ghetto geheißen, Gehen auf Schaber. Mit der Zeit hat sich das Schabern breit verspreit über Polen. Und a viel wohl das Einhandeln hat geheißen Schabrwen. Davon a Schabrovnik. Oft seien Menschen euch bestimmt geworden zu arbeiten bei militärischen Magazinen von Produkten. Das seien gewesen die goldene Kommandes. Wer es hat risikiert, hat da gehabt a Chance zu kennen bei einer Gelegenheit, herunternehmen Tage mamisch Produkten für sich. In Schavler Ghetto hat a Samin Transaktie geheißen Laber die Druske. Der Mensch lebt von Laber die Druske. Also pflegen die Schavler nicht einmal feststellen, dem Cheyune-Mocker von a welchen Jiden. Laberen ist kejedue nehmen auf Link, ganvenen. Druska in Litwisch ist Salz. Und das Wörtel ist aufgekommen zu lieber meissische Heue. A paar Jiden haben bei der Arbeit darum Bahn, der schmeckt a Waggon mit Salz. Was in Anheb Nazi-Okkupatie ist es gewesen a Seltenheit. Einer hat bald reingetanzt in Waggon und genommen schittendem Salz zu sich in Torbe. Der zweite Jid, welcher ist gestanden auf Schmiere, hat dem Chaver seinem Alts gemutigt. Laber die Druske, dann wird die Salz.
Thank you. Indeed, as this excerpt from Yisroel Kaplan's dictionary demonstrates, the topic of stealing, bribing, and smuggling covers the pages of Khurbn Yiddish lexicons. Samen, to poison, begire, to die as an animal, matan beseser, to give in secret, a revered form of charity in Jewish tradition. Vashevin and a rein vashevin, to haul logs out of water and to pull logs in, all now refer to some variant of stealing, smuggling, or black marketeering in Jewish ghettos and camps. Klepsy was a word for theft based on some Yiddishization of the Greek word kleptis, which means brigand. So if you know kleptomania, klepsy became theft here in the ghetto or in a camp, sorry. A term with a similar ring, yet a different etymology, komsa, propped up in the Flossenburg concentration camp as yet another way to say theft. So if we go back to Echo's idea that dictionaries are maps, then the new capital city of Yiddish culture is theft. One of the most important terms in this cluster, the first one that Kaplan mentions in the segment that Michal performed, is organisieren, which literally means to organize. Obviously, the literal meaning is not so interesting or relevant here. That's the point. How does organize, a word whose typical meaning is so mundane, so innocuous, come to mean stealing? So I'd like to step beyond Khurbn Yiddish for a moment and start in the writings of the German philologist that I mentioned, Viktor Klemperer. And in LTE, Lingua Tertii Imperii, he writes that National Socialism replaced the word system that was favored during the Weimar period with Organisation, because Organisation had the root orgeo, organic, which meant that power came from the body. Power was organic, whereas they felt that system, the Weimar word, meant that power, government was organized from the outside. So the Nazis preferred any word that had the root orga, organic, in it to claim that they had a racial claim to their power. And according to Klemperer, he recalls that Organisation had a magical aura in the Nazi lexicon. And however, over time, that magical aura wore off or became ironized. And he recalls that after the Battle of Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943, the word had fallen into ill repute. It smelt of wheeling and dealing, of black marketeering. So somehow in the German lexicon, the word started out, organization started out as a magical term for power, a word of awe and racial superiority, and somehow became some kind of a word for black marketeering. Let's look at how this word works in the Yiddish nexus. A different dynamic emerges there. In an early Khurbn Yiddish lexicon, published serially by the Polish Jewish survivor Shmuel Weintraub in 1946, he defines the term as following: Organizacja. In camp language, this means stealing everything that is important for life. In the camp, organization was a synonym for activism, courage, respectability, and so forth. Young and old, men and women, all took part in organisieren. Here, as you can see, Weintraub is not aware of or interested in any kind of backstory about organic power. He's just talking about organizacja, organization, as theft. And what is more, he calls it Leichtigkeit. It's civil, it's respectable. Stealing is activism. It's a sign of being polite and proper to steal things within this society at this moment. As one might expect, and as actually Kaplan mentions in the segment that Michel performed, organisieren became outdated, and they came up with a whole bunch of new synonyms. Oh, it's all right. Schabern, Schabrevin, Laber, die Druske, many of these came up in the segment that Michel performed. Biegeln, which was apparently taken from a German word denoting the tip of a tram car. Bügel came to mean stealing wood from the tram car, but this got old. And so they then changed the word to chalanem, and taking challah, like ripping off a little piece of challah when you're for ritual purposes, while baking was a new word for stealing wood from a tram car. But then the overseers, the German overseers caught on to that. So they just made one little switch and they changed it to Chane, which is my name in Yiddish, and Chane, from Chala to Chane. Chana is now the new word for stealing wood from a tram car. So it's funny first, and for some, Yisroel Kaplan especially thought this was funny, and I hope you could hear in his writing that he wanted to draw out the humor in this, because there's something clever and witty and funny about this rapid fire invention of words. There's also something dizzying and confusing and disorienting. If you know, Chana was my mother's name yesterday. Now it's a word for stealing from a tram car. And there's also an element beyond this pleasure, humor, and inventiveness. There's a possibility that this hyperactive word replacement on the topic of theft was out of discomfort or shame or embarrassment for what they were doing. And this is the opinion of Yosef Gar, who writes that in general, he was a commentator, a historian who had an appendix of words at the end of his very early history book from 1948. In general, one must admit that in the ghetto, and especially in the camps, people's moral prohibitions became a bit loose, and people would grant themselves different allowances, haters, with a light heart. So he did not find this amusing. And importantly here, what's interesting is that Yosef Gar condemns, who was secular, he condemns organisieren using a religious term, a heter, an allowance, which is a rabbinical term. So it's almost as if he has no terms that would be relevant for law in the ghetto. And so he's reaching out to any kind of legal system that he can remember or think of to recreate this sense of order and law. That all of these words come from an unfillable gap. That is, that Nazis defined Jews by birth as criminals. And so how can you describe criminal activity if everyone has been defined as a criminal? And so I think that from that, looking for a word leads to lots and lots of words. There's more. Yeah, here are some of the additional words that I mentioned. So this is an example of what kinds of scenes we are drawn into through these words. They take us not just into the details and the fabric of daily life, but into some very complex ethical questions that people face there. And the question then I'll end with now is, where did Khurbn Yiddish go? Where did all these words go? If they were so important to people then, there were so many of them, 3,000, why is it that so many people haven't heard of them, even Yiddish speakers? Well, they did stay around. We can hear them orally at the Eichmann trial. We can hear them orally at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in little bits. They haunt other languages. So there's some slang in Hebrew, again, some meme to organize drugs, which I think echoes the organize that I've shared with you from Khurbn Yiddish. And Shabel, an important word of Khurbn Yiddish, shows up in Polish. But the main place where Khurbn Yiddish has been preserved and presented is through literature. So we're going to hear a little bit of that from Michal. And I'll close this part of my remarks before I invite Michal back up to just say that this was something that was, these words were incredibly important to Holocaust victims and survivors at the time. And it's almost as if they sent us a message in a bottle and really wanted posterity to discover these words and look into them. And so when we study Khurbn Yiddish words, we're getting a form of testimony that we can't get otherwise. And we're getting pictures of daily life and experiences that don't come through other sources. And I think that this is why they left us these words in this very, very intensely documented fashion. So Michal, if you would, please. The first thing that Michal is going to present is a cabaret piece from 1942 called Ghetto 1942. It's from the Warsaw Ghetto, signed only with the name Philippe. And this is a poem that both uses a lot of Khurbn Yiddish words, but it's also about the creation of these words. To show you when a Khurbn Yiddish word comes up, we put the translated equivalent in bold and italics. So you can just get a feeling for how densely these words appear. Okay, so let me gear up for my other job here as the super title clicker. Great.
Von Djibov bis Pave, das ist dein Warszawe. Von Grenitz bis Grenitz, a Meluche, a Genetz. Streckst weiter a Hand, Torred zu der Wand. Du hast a Meluche, a feiner Mischmasch, a gemeine Maschine, was zuppt nor die Tasch. A Flocken mit Locken, Ingenieurdiplom, le Oilem a Goilem, mit Beirat von Sdom. Du hast sich der Wart zu a Jid a Postträger, a Brivel, a Kartel trockt dir von Weger, a Prikaz von Eckgas bringt geschwind und bet a Nedove, ver Weib und ver Kind. A Päckel on Deckel, es schickt dir die Post und es fällt dir zum Cheshben noch mehr wie du hast. Auf jeden Rebidel a Tutz Polizei und fahr jeden Spiegel 5 Berglach mit Schnee, a Lente, a Mente und a Poliziant, a Hittel, Gelquittel, schon gar elegant, a Luxus, a Schischke, a Proschik auf Tee, nimm, mach sich a Schnittke von Lebelach mit Schnee, an Iris, ich spür es, wie Smolle mit Gritz, a Ponschke und Monschke, a Typhus mit Hitz. A Chatte mit Leis, a Tramwai bläu-weiß. Koim is dir mies, to geh sich zifies. A Riksche der Quicksche, dich mit a Spazier. Reb Itschke von Britschke, dir öffnet a Tier. A Goles, Levayes, a Frover und Pferd, es macht sich Reklame und man legt dich in der Erd. A Pinkert, vertinkert, dem Ghetto auf Schwarz. Dein Bonne, Matone, los iber auf Marz. Willst essen, Rebidel, am Mittag in Kech, in lehmenem Teller mit Löffel und Blech? Da stell sich in Ogon, west kriegen on Ikev, a Teller mit Wasser, mit Stollen von Brikev, a Gitos, a Mythos von Stitze und Geld, a Zentos, a Vostrektos, besorgt Kinder mit Geld. Mit Geld. Kaum darfst du Linguistik, am Meister von Fach, da sollst du in Gitos nicht suchen kein Sach. A Linder Erfinder von jiddischen Trop, kal jetschet loschen und duld dir a Kopf. A Chauffeur, a Klopper, a Meister von Wort, was macht gar mit Jiddisch, Gymnastik und Sport.
Thank you, Michal. So this piece, as you heard, it ends there. The librettist, the cabaret artist, is making fun of the ghetto elite. He actually, this Philippe embeds the name of one of the ghetto leaders, Menachem Lindel, to say, and Lindel was a Yiddishist, and he was trying to correct Yiddish in the ghetto. And this Philippe is making fun of him and saying that he's doing gymnastics and sport with Yiddish. Leave it alone. Let it develop as it should. One of the other interesting words that appears here is bone matone. Bone was a Polish word for a coupon, and it became a Yiddish word for a food coupon in the Lodz ghetto. But a food coupon was no longer just a food coupon. That was a ticket for life itself. So bone became a word for life. And so this line, dein bone, your bone, a gift, matone, give it up in March, that means commit suicide in March. Giving up your bone meant committing suicide. You can see that this is an incredibly sophisticated use of the words and also an incredibly sophisticated way of preserving them for posterity and showing what they are. And this is what I found, that the work of studying and reflecting on language was not just the domain of the intellectuals or the elites, but people like actors, street singers were just as interested in what was happening to their language. For our final piece, we're going to look at the beginning of book 2 from a trilogy called The Tree of Life that was written by the survivor writer Chava Rosenfarb. It's a 2,000-page trilogy that tries to wrap its arms around all of the Lodz ghetto. It was even longer in manuscript form, as I discovered when I saw the manuscript in her archive. And she uses a lot of Khurbn Yiddish, and she teaches us the language as we go along over the course of these 2,000 words. And the excerpt that we're going to present for you now is the moment when Jews were forced into the Lodz ghetto in February of 1940. So you can imagine that Jews living all over the Lodz area, 160,000, are forced into a neighborhood roughly the size of downtown Northampton. And this is something that she views in this moment as a soundscape. This is portrayed through the perspective of a teenager named Dovid, who narrates the imprisonment of Jews in the Lodz ghetto through the perspective of language. So.
I was pushing a baby carriage with our belongings, listening to people talk. This talking, a chapter unto itself. They dragged their luggage, panting and philosophizing about Jewish fate, or they talked normally, casually. And both kinds of conversations sounded equally strange. Near us, a woman, thin and scrawny, was walking with a hump of bedding on her back. She looked like a camel and kept mumbling to herself. Oi, Keile ist schon mehr nicht kein Mensch. Keile ist schon mehr nicht kein Mensch. Her repetitive mumbling was so catchy that I could hardly refrain from joining in with my own about myself. Oi, David ist schon mehr nicht kein Mensch. Or, for instance, this couple walking nearby. She, petite, plump, and red like a piglet. He, huge, broad-shouldered, and bull-like, and festooned from head to foot with chairs, tables, cupboards, sacks, and packs. She, the wife, carried nothing. Instead, she was surrounded by 6 children and held 3 of their hands in each of hers. In the meantime, she was engaged in a quarrel with her husband as they marched on. She squeaked in a thin, childlike voice. Oi, die Erde soll dich schon einschlingen, Itzig. Was willst du in meine jinge Juren haben? Verwus hast du nicht mitgenommen die treifende Schüssel? Verwus hast du nicht? Lebendiger Heid hast du mich in Kaiver reinjugen hast du mich. The man pushed ahead as he bent down to her with his clattering paraphernalia. Gittel, du sagst etwas. Und für wemens Schwarzjahr hast du gelossenes Keulenkästel? She said something. Met dich nicht wie ein Stückel Keul reinzulegen, Malachamuvis meiner. In geb Achtung auf die Viadres, ein Unglück ist mir oi, das doch noch reißlosen die milchige Gefäß, als nicht gedacht soll es werden. The pails on the man's back tilted even more as he bent down to his wife. Hey, Gittel, du sagst etwas. And behind me, a group was speaking Polish. A woman's voice, a girl's, and a man's. The woman cried, The girl barked at her. Hör auf zu weinen, Mamusha. The man's voice comforted. Przysięgam ci, kochanie, hab allein übergekickt die Klosetten, die reinste in ganz Balut. The woman was inconsolable. Ja, zgasne jak świeca przy te zasmucone kuchni. The girl's voice warned. Oib die hörst nicht auf zu weinen, Mamushu, geh ich weg. The woman now became even more hysterical. Guy, całe świat mnie opuszcza. The man went on again soothingly. Wein nicht, kochanie. Nie taki czarny diabel, jako molują. Die Schreinem haben mich versichert, als die Meisen Stures kommen nur auf die niedrige Stocken. In mir, Teibelemans, wollen wohnen unter ein samme Dach. Es wird sein luftig.
Thank you, Micho.
Ew.
Yeah. Great. So we heard some of the social dynamics that led to the drastic change in Yiddish, that people from different classes are coming together and living together in really close quarters who had never maybe talked to each other. Different languages, Polish and Yiddish, are now coming together, and those are creating new words, those frictions between the different layers within Yiddish and other languages. And also the experiences of shock are creating different conditions for speaking and listening. And the character Dovid, Rosenfarb's character Dovid, put it so well. I listened to the talk around me. This speech is a whole topic unto itself. Either people whined, dragging their baggage and philosophizing about the Jewish fate, or people spoke, quote unquote, normally in a day-to-day manner, and this too sounded strange. So to conclude this part of our program, I would suggest learning from the character Dovid that under the circumstances of such upheaval, there is virtually no way of making language stand still. Thank you. So, Avi.
Okay, so thank you all for being here, and it's really an honor for me to have the opportunity to serve as moderator for a discussion on what is really a brilliant book, I have to say. So thank you for inviting me to participate in the program. As you suggest, right, it's words matter, right, and it's really I think a unique and innovative way of writing this history, to focus on the spoken word, the words that people use. But as you also suggest in the book, you propose to study, and I'm going to quote, the strange, grotesque, humorous, and sometimes beautiful Yiddish words that were born of prisoner experiences in Nazi ghettos and camps, terms that, as you write, amassed into the sociolect called Khurbn Yiddish, or destruction Yiddish. But as you've also suggested here in your presentation, in your remarks, this is not a 21st century project that you have undertaken. It is something that builds on the important work of Jews during the war who were observing the transformations that were taking place, and then these projects that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the war. That is a different form of bearing witness, a different form of testimony, but again provides us with a unique insight by focusing on the spoken language that Jews used during and then immediately after the war to understand the effects of persecution, the effects of living under extreme conditions, how it literally transformed the volksmoil, right? The people's mouth. And I think, again, in terms of paying attention to the words that we use, it's a fascinating concept that Yisrael Kaplan studies, as you talked about, both during and then immediately after the war, right? What are the sort of collective expressions? And he's fascinated by this, right? The collective expressions that people use that are developed during the war, and that there's this urgency to write about it, to document it, right? Immediately, but barely, before liberation, really, he's already writing it. So I guess my first question, because I'm really fascinated, I mean, all the examples you talk about are quite fascinating, but I'm fascinated by this example of Yisrael Kaplan, das Volksmål Nazi Klem, how he sort of is urgently undertaking this project, and is also, as you alluded to, sort of keenly attuned to humor, to irony, to wit, to double entendres, which are all over the place, to the ways that language can function as sort of a code that Jews might use amongst themselves in camps and ghettos. So tell us, this is a long prologue to a
No, it's
question.
great.
Tell us a little bit about the case of Yisrael Kaplan specifically,
Yeah.
and his evolving relationship to the Yiddish language, both during, immediately after, and then the years after the war, and how this approach to Khurbn Yiddish can help us understand what you describe as the metamorphosis of
Yeah,
the Yiddish language.
thank you
Yeah.
so much. It's really great to have you here. So let me first locate Yisrael Kaplan in the book. The book has 3 sections to it. The first section is about the people who were interested in Khurbn Yiddish language consciousness, because I wanted to give them credit, first of all, for the work that they did, and also to tell their stories of why they became interested in it. And then I have the middle section is about the words, and the last section is about the echoes in the literary aftermath of Khurbn Yiddish. So within that first section, Yisrael Kaplan is a major player, and he is, I have to admit, one of the critiques that I got of the book was that I identified too much with some of the historical figures I'm describing. And in the case of Yisrael Kaplan, that's definitely true. I definitely fell in love with him in a way. I mean, he evokes a lot of empathy. He was a really, really dedicated teacher before the war in Kovna. And he also studied Hebrew. He taught Hebrew. He knew Lithuanian really well. He was part of the Lithuanian Jewish Ethnographic Society, and he was really interested in words even then. So he thought that in this museum that they were trying to build, they'd have like a glass case with, an old Talmud and a menorah, and then they'd have words. This is how he looked at language. And his son, whom I got to know over the course of this project, said that he was a guy who always walked around with a little notebook in his pocket to write down whatever interesting words he was hearing. And he did that throughout the ghetto. And he claims in the camp too, his materials from the ghetto were lost. And he writes about that. His son writes about that. But the diary that we do have, it starts like as this American soldiers are approaching, right? And he is what a Khurbn Yiddish speaker would call a Musulman. He's skeletal. He's not digesting food. He's not thinking right. He actually was defined as dead a few months before this. And like you said, one of his first tasks is to write down words. And he stands up in a hospital in Munich, and he describes himself in his diary. And he says, my head is bandaged, my swollen head is bandaged, and I delivered this lecture. And then you read the lecture. Of course, the lecture is like 10 times better than anything I could ever produce if I had all my full health and quiet. Produces this lecture, and at the end of it, he says, join me in saving our inheritance. And what is that inheritance? Then he gives this list of like 7 extremely dirty, vulgar words from the camps. It's like, this is your idea. But he meant it. This is what he thought. He thought these were dirty words were incredible. By the way, also the way that I got access to this diary was through his son. He let me come and sit in his kitchen and read his father's papers. And it was fascinating to do that. So what was his special, outlook? Like, because each of the people had a different philosophy of language. Nachman Blumenthal, the man about whom I spoke at the very beginning of my short lecture, he was trained in the psychology of art and the psychology of language. So he had a very, very sophisticated psychological approach to these words. He called them a psychomotoric response to shock. And then Elias Spivak, who was the Soviet, he was a Marxist, and he looked at these words in terms of a dialect and pain and heroism coming together and creating a brand new Yiddish. Kaplan was not a theorist. Khurbn Yiddish was his native language. his notes, looking in his diary in the early pages, he can barely write. I mean, it's crazy. His handwriting is crazy. His sentence structure is all over the place. And the words were a symptom of what he'd experienced. They weren't the whole experience of language. And so he records these words, and over time, I see his different versions and he edits them. He starts out incredibly bitter about everyone around him. He doesn't fit in the DP camp crowd, the displaced persons crowd in his hospital, because he says that they're too into card playing and cursing, and they're making fun of him and for being too intellectual, like a pansy, like, oh, pansy, go write this in your little notebook. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, he says he doesn't fit in with the sophisticated elites because they're pretending like everything is normal. So this was his path to find something that was not pretending to be normal and was not anti-intellectual, was this folklore, and it meant so much to him. And it starts out bitter, and over time it becomes funny. And I think that I see the edits. I mean, he's editing, he's crossing things out for comic timing to make it sound like these words were about getting back at the Nazis by making the words funny in a way. And I think that that spoke to his experience of pulling himself together by seeing himself as this ghetto version of himself, ironically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a fascinating figure to study. And I think one of the insights that you make in the book is sort of, I mean, he's also one of the key players in the creation of the historical commissions and sort of the documentation projects and writing down the testimonies. But one of the things that's fascinating is it's changing this sort of the change over time that takes place in terms of understanding Jewish behavior during the war, right? And the way that we can understand it through words. And so where there might be certain judgments involved either during or immediately after the war, over time, it sort of evolves and shifts, right? And you might see the irony of the situation, you might see the absurdity of the situation and how words can help you understand just how absurd it is, but with the distance. And so it's fascinating to see how his orientation changes.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So as you pointed out before, the book has 3 parts. The first part, which it's a 3-act sort of approach.
Exactly. 3-act show.
Yeah. So the first,
kind of like today, you can see it's a habit, thinking in threes, right?
Right.
Three elements. Okay.
I will not be reciting any beautiful poetry in the way that Michal did it, though.
No.
But as you point out, so the first part focuses on the key players and sort of documentation and paying attention to the words. And then the second part, you focus specifically on the words themselves. And I will say, and I know there's going to be a sale afterwards and a book signing, the book does come with a very handy glossary at the back, glossary of Khurbn Yiddish terms used. And as you pointed out in the slideshow, there are 3 categories of words that you focus on. Words for theft, what you call German Yiddish hybrids, and then words that describe sort of the effeminate Jewish body. And it's excellent in terms of just drilling down and saying, okay, let's do a study of sort of how these words work. So since you talked about Schablevin and Organisieren, so words for theft, I want to ask you specifically about some of the German Yiddish hybrids. And I will just say, you have this great line in the beginning of chapter 6. You write, in the world of Khurbn Yiddish, one vowel sound can take the witness stand. Just so smart, like sort of such a great line. So tell me about the one word, okay, Jude.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's talk about that word.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad most people kind of shy away from this chapter because of the German Yiddish hybrids. They feel like it's going to be really technical, and that's actually why I started with that line, because I wanted to signal to people, this is not technical. I'm not here to, tell you how much I know Yiddish or German or something, or prove that you don't know. I'm really talking about these syllables that had huge meaning differences. And I can start by saying that's also, I mean, it's my sentence, but the idea was actually Franz Kafka's. And he, in 1912, he spoke to a German-speaking audience in Prague. he brought the Yiddish theater. He brought a Yiddish theater troupe to Prague. He became fascinated by Yiddish. He brought a Yiddish theater troupe to Prague to perform before German speakers. And he said, don't be afraid of Yiddish. You can understand much more than you would guess. And then he said, however, it's impossible to translate Yiddish to German and German to Yiddish. And he said, for example, how can you translate Blut in German to Blut in Yiddish? It seems like it's the same word, but with different letters. But the connotations, the worlds of meaning that these two words contain are huge. And that proximity was, it was a danger in a sense, because, well, it was a gift because you could understand, but it was also a danger because you will then erase those worlds of history and meaning that are so different in the two different words. So Jude is kind of like that. Jude means, like, I don't have a German accent because whatever German I know through Yiddish, but you know, if you're like writing it in Latin characters, you know, Yod, J-U-D-E, that means Jew in German, and Jew in Yiddish is Yid. So let's say that's 1.5 syllables difference. But what a world of difference in terms of what that meant, especially during the Holocaust. Jude was the objectified Jew from the outside. And it was a word that was more than a word. It appeared everywhere. And it was something that literally was materialized in the patch that people had to wear. There were, I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of compound words built out of this. Judenpost, Judenmaterial, Judentoit, Judenfrei, Juden. So for Yiddish speakers, on the one hand, Jude in like, you know, Yiddish characters, Jude, Yud, Vav, Dalid, Ayin, Jude. On the one hand, it signified this objectifying outside notion of a Jew. And on the other hand, it was also their way of saying their idea of a Jew is not who I am. I'm a Yid. They think they are talking to me as if I'm a Jude, but I'm not. And you see this in their writings that they say they're talking about Jews as in their own self-perceptions, and they say Yid and Yid. And then when they're talking about Jews, as the Nazis saw them, it's Jude. One example is from a Soviet diary memoir. I guess he edited, you know, Soviets always, they especially edited things before they went to press, even if they were written in real time, by a partisan named Herr Smolar from Minsk. And he writes about this man named Reuven, and supposedly in the book, Reuven is leaving the ghetto to join the partisans, and he writes a note to the Germans, and somehow he writes it in Yiddish. Okay, it's not all totally believable, but whatever. He writes this note to the Germans, and he says, that Jude that you know, Reuven, is no more. I'm a Yid, and I'm going to fight with the partisans. So the word, just these 2 syllables, had so much meaning for people. The slight change, and German had a way of getting into Yiddish because of this proximity. And people, there's a long tradition of Yiddish speakers incorporating German words into their language to sound fancy. You know, that was in the Jewish Enlightenment, in the Haskalah. Yiddish speakers Germanified their speech to like talk up, you know, to sound upper class. And so there were some people in the ghettos and camps who, when they incorporated Nazi words, that's what they felt like they were doing, just making themselves sound fancy. And that's how some German words made their way into Yiddish. But then you hear these words, these moments like the one I just cited with Herr Smolar, where they're saying, whoa, hold on a minute. This is actually a different language and a different conceptual system, and we're going to use it because we have to, but we're also going to signify that it's not our language, it's not our self-perception.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And as you get into it, sort of the politics of the words that you end up using. And I like the theater example is such an interesting example, because I could see in the DP camps, you have a lot of Yiddish theater, but on the one hand, if theater had been sort of more prone to use a Deutschmarisch Yiddish that sort of used a lot of German words, what's the politics then of using those words in the aftermath?
It's very, right, it's complicated. And some people, mean, we don't have time for every word, of course, but another one of those words was the word Aussiedlung from the German Aussiedlung, which Aussiedlung in Yiddish, pre-war Yiddish, means to curse someone out. Siedeln, okay, to curse, use curse words. And in German, Aussiedlung means relocation. But the Nazis used Aussiedlung to mean expulsion. So it was already a euphemism, a Nazi German euphemism. Aussiedlung was not just relocation. Obviously, there was already a lie within the word, but then it gets into Yiddish and people are writing this again and again and again. Why are we all of a sudden using the word Aussiedlung to talk about expulsion? This isn't cursing. This is expulsion. But the words are so close, they can't help it. And so and again, there's some like language activism with partisans in the Warsaw Ghetto saying our first mission must be to tell people Aussiedlung means expulsion and death, because there's so many layers of first the German euphemism and then the, like you said, the, you know, fancy Yiddish talking up and using words that people don't totally understand but sound fancy. And they said we got to cut through all of these different layers of positive or fancy connotations and tell people what this is actually going to mean.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, as you suggest, sort of the self-expression, right? What one calls oneself, right?
Yeah.
A Yid versus a Yud. This will be my last question.
Okay.
Then I think we'll have time to open up for Q&A from the audience. So 3 parts to the book. So I'll ask you about the third part. Although as you point out in the beginning of the third part, where you focus on literary aftermaths and sort of how Khurbn Yiddish is used, that even in the case of, you know, a poet like Avram Sutzkever, it becomes like this question of, do you use Khurbn Yiddish in your poetry, right? Becomes like a very significant question where you're thinking about sort of how consciously will you employ this type of Yiddish. So I want to ask you, you focus in the third part on Yechiel Dinur, who might be familiar to some of the audience as Katsetnik, the author of the House of Dolls and People and other works. But I want to ask you about Chava Rosenfarb, who might be less familiar to broader audiences. So what was it about her approach to Yiddish and the Yiddish language in the aftermath that led you to focus to choose her as sort of the final chapter that you wanted to share in Khurbn Yiddish?
Thank you. Yeah, Chava Rosenfarb was another one of those people that I was criticized for over-identifying with. But you know what? I don't know. There's nothing I could do about it, really.
As long as you're aware of your subjectivity, you can do whatever.
You know what? I think that under-identification is overrated. I think I don't know. I'm not going to, I find that being fascinated and admiring these people really does drive my work. I don't see how people can write so much about people. A lot of people, you know, go through their papers and read thousands and thousands of pages. I mean, to get through a 2,000-page trilogy, you know, in Yiddish, I went actually to one of our favorite getaway spots. It's on the border of between Israel and Egypt. It's off the grid, and I sat in a hut and I went there every so often, and I would get through, okay, you know, 400 pages and another 400 pages, you know, annotating and so forth. So over the course of that time, I had a lot of conversations with her, you know, and then I started translating her poetry, and then I got to know her daughter. So I have a lot of feelings about her life, and she wrote this 2,000-page trilogy as a working mother. She was working in a factory and raising 2 children. Her husband was a famous Canadian lawyer, actually fighting for reproductive rights. And she had almost no time to herself. She started writing this as a refugee right when she got out. That's the notebook that I showed you. And then she kept going with this, writing little bits at 4 a.m. before her children woke up and before she had to go and do her shift. And that durational reflection is one of the strengths of her writing, in that she's really looking for a long-term experience with the audience. And there's so much, it also, what attracted me to her writing was that she goes totally, completely against the highfalutin, I guess you could call it like French postmodern idea that you can't represent the Holocaust. It's too horrible. She says, God damn it, I'm going to represent everything I can. Every little corner, every event in the Lodge Ghetto, I'm going to try to write something about it. And so those are kind of some reasons. Now, what about her use of Khurbn Yiddish in particular that I find so interesting? She writes as a 20-something-year-old survivor, when she comes out and she's publishing her first little booklet of poems, she says, you people of the world, and you Jewish brothers and sisters who were not there. So just pause for a second. A 20-something-year-old no-name poet who's just gotten out of Auschwitz believes that one day her poetry is going to be accessible for people all over the world, Jews and non-Jews alike. That's a very powerful vision to have at that time. And she says, one of the things you're going to have to do to understand my poetry is understand our words. You're going to have to get to know these words. So my paraphrase of that is, you're going to have to come to me. I'm not going to translate myself into, another language. I'm not going to get rid of the ghetto words that we use. I'm going to use them. And then she says, these are going to become a shared estate for all of us. So, and this is, what's the end of this? It's not really just about knowledge or understanding daily life. She said, this is about teaching love, that it's an act of love to learn a victim's language. It's an act of love to listen to a victim group as they spoke and as they heard themselves. This is an act of generosity. It's an act of curiosity and an act of solidarity. And that's how she phrased her project, and at a very young age, in a really early stage in her career. And she really does follow through on this promise throughout her writing, including in this trilogy, in that there's, first of all, there's a lot of love. And in her drafts, there were even more. Like, there's a redheaded communist who has like 4 different love affairs in the published version. I think it's 8 in the draft, but okay, you get the idea. Love, like actual love, sex, romance, but there's love also in the way that she is trying to let us see all these different people and their perspectives, and to come with them. And there's love in the way she presents the language, in making each word into a kind of poetry, awakening the beauty and the agency that was dormant or latent in these words to begin with, drawing them out for people through this artistic presentation. And that's why I wanted to end with her. And she is open about the fact that I called it reconstructing, because she's very, very open about the fact that this is not a, frame by frame chronological reconstruction. It's her own way of looking back and infusing feminism and love into a past where women were ignored, but they were always there, but they were ignored, bringing out small words from the margin, making them big, bringing out small people from the margin, making them big. Mothers, housewives, sex workers, maids, these are big characters for her, just like these little words are big thoughts and big ideas for her. So I wanted to end with her because I felt like that was as close to my vision of what these words could give us in 2024 as I could articulate.
Excellent. Thank you. So I see Lisa has a microphone.
I do. We have a full house virtually and a full house actually. So we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask everybody to please keep questions really succinct and answers short so we can try to get to all of them. I'm going to field the ones from online. I'll start with that. Thank you so much, Hannah. Brilliant, interesting. What set you in the direction of this project?
My previous book was about Holocaust, oral and audiovisual Holocaust testimony. And I was listening to a lot of Yiddish language testimonies, and I kept running into these words going, what is this word? And asking people who know Yiddish better than me, and they said, I don't know. And then someone handed me a dictionary, Nachman Blumenthal's dictionary, and I said, there are 3,000 of these words? Oh, and there's lots more dictionaries of this. There must be a story behind it. And that's how I got onto it. Thank you.
And just raise your hand and I'll pass the mic. Okay. Unless you have a loud booming voice.
There might be some people in here with loud booming voices. It's happened before. Yiddish culture, loud booming voices. Okay.
I have I have a couple thoughts. One is I was reminded first of what I heard about the Yiddish thieves language, where they used a lot of Hebrew
Yes.
words, and so I was really interested to hear like not only Hebrew but Latvian and probably other languages
Yeah.
brought in that would have been incomprehensible to Germans. And also thinking about Nazi code talker, sorry,
Yeah.
Navajo code
Oh.
talkers, just another
That's a great one. Yeah.
branch of that whole realm. And the question I have is about Rosenfarb's segment here, where there was a family and the daughter was speaking Yiddish and the parents were speaking Polish. And I thought that was so interesting. Do you have
Yeah.
any explanation of that?
I thank you. First of all, I hadn't thought of the Navajo code talkers. I'm always looking for more and more parallels. That's actually something I want to do now, is to branch out and come up with parallels and comparisons. So thank you for that. There is a lot of humor, writing, theater about the collision of Polish and Yiddish in the ghettos. It's not that Polish and Yiddish didn't coexist before then, but not with this intensity. So I don't know if that was, a literal thing that she overheard, or if she was kind of trying to somehow key us into this collision between Yiddish and Polish. That Yiddish speak, Polonized Jews tended to, live in some community, and then really intensely Yiddish speaking Jews didn't, lived in their own community, and now they're all living on top of each other. There's actually a theater piece that I describe in the book from Warsaw called Love Looks for an Apartment, where a Yiddish speaking couple and a Polish speaking couple are forced to live together in a 1-bedroom. And there's a lot of humor from that. So it's about the collision of language, and then eventually the mixing, that also Polish speakers. There's a diary of a young Polish girl saying, "What am I doing? My Polish is turning into Yiddish." So that was part of the experience, but I don't know about that one in particular. Yeah.
Anyone else in the audience? Okay, we have a similar question from the audience at home. Were there any new Hebrew-based words included in the dictionary?
Oh, yes, definitely. Lots and lots of them. One is malech, which it means angel, malach in Hebrew. It's also in Yiddish, angel, same thing. It means an underage child that was paid to do the work of an adult, paid to take on the slave labor of the adult in the Khurbn ghetto. So there's obviously, that's a devastating semantic meaning to learn about, but there's also some humor and some poetry and irony, dark irony, in that, of pulling this celestial being down to earth and using this prestigious Hebraic Loshen Kodesh word to describe something so lowly. There's also, on the similar line, Yale, like Ya'ale, like someone's going up to the Torah, Ya'ale, Yale was an insider. So, here comes a Yale, like somebody who is higher up. Lots and lots of words like that. Yeah.
Or like a social climber.
A social
Also
climber. Yeah,
Yale,
exactly. A
yeah.
social climber. Somebody's climbing up to the bima. A Yale is a social climber, right?
Yeah.
What?
Did the trilogy ever get translated into English?
Oh yeah, it's shortened in the English, but it's pretty good actually. I mean, maybe some people are happy that it's shorter. It's worth reading. It's worth reading in English for sure.
We have a question from the virtual audience for you, Avi. In your work, I'm curious to know how this may, if it has or hasn't, inform how you teach and how people can access more of your work in terms of the history that you teach? I think that's
Sure.
what they're asking.
So specifically, and we talked about this in a different context. One of the things that I found fascinating about Kaplan, so I have an interest in how humor was used during and after the war. And so Kaplan, Yisrael Kaplan's project about the Volksmoil is an excellent source for understanding how Jews used humor both during and after the war, the ironic use, the double entendres, the witticisms. So I have, in a number of my classes, both on Jewish responses and in the Jewish humor class, I use that text and that source. But I'm also, we were talking about, I'm teaching a seminar on the aftermath of the Holocaust next semester at NYU, and we're going to use this book. So because I think it's an excellent study to sort of show sort of the nature of Jewish responses to persecution, and then the sort of ways that the Yiddish language responded to it, and then how Jews processed it in the aftermath of the war.
One of those booming voices your mom warned you about. Okay.
So I'm curious about the ways in which these words emerged in situations where, say, in partisan situations, you had perhaps Jews and Poles living together, working together, but in many cases somewhat suspicious of one another. And so
Yeah.
what examples did you find of how the language sort of coped and helped in those sort of situations?
And also Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian there too. That would have been a topic that I could have chosen. You know, I could have had a chapter on that. It's a really rich topic. They have a really rich language for everything from kitchens to obviously weapons and weaponry to roles, housing, you know, all the tools that they used to build their resistance, and the multilingualism led to a really rich sociolect for partisans. I didn't choose it for my book, but I really hope someone will write about it. Sam Kassow, who's I know familiar to some of you, the great historian, he said that as a child of survivors, he said that was the first time he got clued in to Khurbn Yiddish, was when he heard partisans talking in Yiddish after the war, and he said, "Woo, you know, this is strange." And then he got interested in that too. So maybe I don't know if he'll be the one to write that one up, but I hope someone will, because that's another really interesting subtopic of its own. Yeah.
And one of the things that you allude to in the book also is how Lagersprach, the language of the camps, also sort of, you see lots of different groups coming together, lots of different languages coming together, and then how those inform one another, which is also quite fascinating.
Yeah, that was a hard, I tried to drill into what's the difference between Khurbn Yiddish in the ghettos and in the camps. And this is hard, you know, because there was just so little documentation of prisoner experience in real time in the camps. Look, there were at least 40 different languages spoken in Auschwitz. And woo, that doesn't sound good. Okay. There are Roma words that enter Yiddish in Auschwitz. There are Greek words, there are French words, Hungarian. So the multilingualism definitely increases in the camps.
We have time for one last
all right.
question.
Yeah.
Great.
Community.
You know, I don't think so too much. Aussiedlung, the word for deportation that used to mean cursing, that one's been changed forever. That's an example where the dictionary changed. They changed it in the dictionary, and they have a note, and they said after World War II, this actually means expulsion. That's a case where people don't even realize which version of the word they're using. They're not aware of the history. But really, people were quite ashamed of these words. They were kicked out of newspapers. They were, you know, kept away from purposefully. Actually, I once gave a lecture on this years ago on my research when it was still ongoing. to a group of students at the University of Haifa, and there was a woman there from the Haredi community, and she found it very offensive. You know, like, I'm airing dirty laundry. Why would you say that this is how my parents spoke? I don't know, you know, what to say there, but that's why these pockets, I mean, yeah, in the initial years, Blumenthal, Kaplan, there was a big success. People loved Kaplan's dictionary. They loved Blumenthal's work. They thought this was going to be a big hit. And then more powerful cultural actors, both within Yiddish, but mostly without, came by and said, no, thank you. So Yad Vashem in Israel didn't employ Kaplan. He works as a clerk in a hospital, and then he was a school teacher until he retired. So he didn't get to develop the topic. Blumenthal was paid for other work, but not for the Yiddish work by Yad Vashem. And Elias Spivak was murdered in the Soviet Union. I mean, he was arrested in 1949, and he died supposedly of a stroke during interrogations. And one of the last things he published was this dictionary. So the people who wanted to get these words, to preserve these words as cultural actors, were either pushed, you know, sidelined or killed. And there were, I think, the greater number of cultural actors, not saying survivors themselves, who liked their own memory the way that it was, were people who were embarrassed by this. The line in the book is, Khurbn Yiddish, Holocaust Yiddish, was the Yiddish of Yiddish after the war. So that.
Hard to imagine that you started here. I will just add, in high school as a volunteer, and
Yes, I did, right.
and so if we can have bragging rights, thank you. No, you
Yeah.
you do Yiddish proud, and I would add that Michael Yashinsky came here to learn Yiddish, and it's great to have him back in the house, having accomplished as much as he did. And Avi, I would be remiss to say that every time we invite you as a moderator, you deliver more to us than we had ever hoped for. So thank you all
Thank
for a
you.
great program.
Thanks to Lisa, and thank you to Elizabeth for all her hard work organizing, and thanks to everyone who came.
Books are ready for you for signing up front, and there's a little reception in the library. Thank you.